Hello everyone, Shalom Lekulam. It's a great pleasure to host this meeting again, the Israeli Forum for Sustainable Nutrition. Today with us is Carole. I met Carole a few months ago in Harvard just before the COVID, and it was a pleasure to meet her and discuss a lot about food policies. And she just recently graduated from the Kennedy Policy Governance School of Harvard with a very, very interesting thesis about food policy that she's going to share with us. We're really looking forward to discussing this and hearing her thoughts about our work as well. But we really want to hear her first. Afterwards, we will have a Q&A session. I will start with a very brief 2 questions with Carole, kind of to put everyone on the same ground, and then we will open the floor, or the Zoom actually, to other questions, and we could have a discussion a little bit about food policy in general, her work, or other thoughts that people feel like sharing. Just a few words about Carole. So she recently graduated from Harvard, the public policy, her thesis, which she's going to share with us. She also has a bachelor's and a master's degree from the business engineering in Brussels, in the University Libre de Brussels. Sorry for my bad pronunciation. She has a lot of talents and also very strong backgrounds in exact sciences and economy and policy and business. And also she's been a consultant with McKinsey. So she has been and seen a lot of other stakeholders and been in many, many other places in the world and also developing countries. And I think that kind of positions her to be able to talk in broadly about policy and food policy specifically. So with this very brief introduction, I will pass to Carole. Just a few very brief notes. We ask people who have questions to wait a little bit, and it's very difficult to stop in the middle of the Zoom. And so if you have a question, please wait till the end. If it's something that you can't wait, then please try to put that in the chat and we'll try to answer that. And then afterwards, we'll have a very elaborate discussion about it, about food policy in general. And also, I think we would like to have this discussion also with the Israeli textile. We're trying to develop, starting a process of food policy in Israel. And we really want to learn from Carole how she started this project and thesis and research in a connection with the EU. So Carole, please, it's all yours and we'll talk afterwards.
Awesome, thank you so much for this warm introduction. I'm gonna start sharing my screen now. So I'll just take over. Oh, I just think that Sigal, you need to stop sharing so I can start sharing afterwards. Perfect, thank you. Okay, let's start. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. For me, it's really a pleasure to be able to discuss a little bit the findings and the results of my research, because of course, there's no best reward. I was just discussing that with Sigal the other day. There's no best reward for like a researcher to see their results used and to disseminate them. So it's thanks a lot for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. So just to give you an overview of what I would like to cover today. So first of all, I'll go through a little bit the results of the introduction survey. So there's still time for you to complete it if you haven't done so. The link is in the chat. Then I'll give you a background, a little bit the context of my research. I'll explain briefly the methodology that I followed. And then the bulk of the presentation will really be to describe to you the key recommendations I made to the European Commission, so specifically the 8 recommended policies. And I'll finish by just giving you like the latest news from the European Farm to Fork strategy so that you can know already a little bit how this research was used and which types of policy it aims to inform. And after that, we'll have the Q&A. So let's start directly with the introduction survey. I will show you the results of what everyone replied so that everyone can also know a little bit who is on the call and who we have here in our Zoom room. So in terms of organization where people work, so yeah, interesting to see that a lot of us work in education, research institution, a bunch of NGOs, and also government officials, which is great because I think it's one thing that I've noticed with my research is that you really need to actually gather quite a lot of different people around the table to make policies about food, about like directing people's consumption choices and so on. So that's really cool. Let's see, in terms of the themes where people work. So we have a lot of people working in environment, but also nutrition, policy in general, and other profiles. So that's great. We have here a quite diverse set of backgrounds. And I'm very happy to see this. So basically, I was kind of guessing that the vast majority of the people would be in favor of adopting policies to reduce the consumption of meat and dairy, because otherwise we would not have registered for the talk in the first place. But I guess it's still good to see. This question is actually from what I know and the people I've met from the European Commission with whom I've discussed. This is definitely still a controversial topic, at least there's no broad agreement on whether we should do this or not. It's really a conversation that is only starting now, actually. And then let's see. So that I was interested in this question because basically it's a bit of a spoiler because those are basically the 8 recommended policies I made to the European Commission, but I was interested in seeing whether there was some that were more interesting for you than others so that I can tailor a little bit my presentation. But okay, I see that pretty much all of them will be quite interesting. Okay, and then my favorite question. Favorite plain bread. I knew there would be a lot of hummus lovers out there. I am one myself, so this, warms my heart. I was hoping, the Belgian in me was hoping to see chocolate in there, but everyone seems to be quite healthy, so there's a lot of vegetables. I love that. Potatoes, beans, almonds also one of my favorites. Okay, great. Good to see that. Oh, people are still responding, awesome. Mangoes, of course, mangoes. Why didn't I think of that? Okay, perfect. So now that we know each other a tiny bit better already, I will continue with the presentation. So I'll start by giving you a little bit the context and a bit of background about my research so that you can really understand it. So basically, the bulk of my research aims to inform the new Farm to Fork strategy of the European Commission. So this strategy, it's one of the 8 pillars of the European Green Deal that was announced in December of last year. And it's quite exciting because it's really the first time that the European Commission wants to look at to make the entire value chain of food more sustainable all the way to the consumption stage. Because in the past, it was often, there's a lot of policies about the production, of course, how to make beef production more sustainable, for example, those kind of things, but there's much less conversation about the consumption and really how can we try to make people eat foods that are less greenhouse gas intensive, for example. So it's really like a new opportunity now with this European Green Deal to start to adopt these kind of policies. And so I personally worked mainly with the Directorate General on Climate Action from the European Commission, but since this is very much of a cross-sectoral topic, I was also in contact with people from the Directorate General on Health, on agriculture and research and innovation mainly. And so the conclusions that I will present to you, these are really very much my personal views. So I did this work with the European Commission in the sense that I contacted them a lot. They guided me through my research to basically make it as useful as possible for them. But this still remains like my personal views, basically. And so in terms of why did I focus on reducing meat, dairy, and food waste? I mean, I'm sure a lot of you know these kind of things, but basically agriculture represents a significant, like 10% of European greenhouse gas emissions, and livestock, so meat and dairy, are the majority of these greenhouse gases. So, and in addition to that, reducing consumption of meat and dairy also presents health and other environmental benefits. So I won't go into too much details about that. We can talk about it in the Q&A. But basically, there's quite a strong case to be made to reducing meat and dairy. And then food waste is also significant in the EU. It's about 20% of all food produced that are wasted. So it's also, if you reduce food waste, then the assumption is that you can also reduce the production of food in general and also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's it for the context. Then let me just touch on the methodology that I use in my research. So it's quite straightforward. Basically, I started with a long list of 22 policy options that I created by doing an extensive literature search, some expert interviews, and there I really wanted to be very open-minded about what the solutions could be. Then I sat down with my contacts from the European Commission and I reviewed this list to basically eliminate the most unlikely options for the Commission to pursue. So for example, in this long list, I had suggestions like advertising Mediterranean diets or other types of Asian cuisines that are traditionally low in meat and dairy. But this is something that the Commission has never done, to really advertise specific types of food or advertise anything in general. And so this was just something that they knew they would never adopt such a policy, for example. So that's how I got to a short list of 11 policy options, which I then assessed based on specific criteria that I agreed on with the Commission. So this was, for example, what is the greenhouse gas reduction potential? What is the cost of these options? What is the impact on food prices and on producers' income? Because those are things that the Commission in general is interested in, and they take those things into account when they adopt specific policies. And so basically then the 8 recommended policy that I got at the end are the ones who perform the best on these criteria. So now that you have an idea of the flow that I followed, let's jump in directly into those specific key recommendations. So you've seen them already in the survey, so it was a bit of a spoiler. But so basically the 8 policies I recommended at the end of my report are, so first of all, so to reduce subsidies going to meat and dairy production, introduce an emission trading scheme for agriculture. There was already one in the EU, but it doesn't cover agriculture. It only covers like heavy industries. Reduce food waste at the consumer level through communication and education campaigns. Negotiate binding agreements with retailers to nudge consumers towards less meat and dairy and reduce food waste. Remove regulatory barriers for alternatives to meat and dairy to reach the EU market. This one is really inspired by conversations I had with food entrepreneurs, like the executive chair of Beyond Meat, for example, or also the Good Food Institute in Europe that works quite closely with food entrepreneurs. Educating kids on the health and environmental impacts of meat and dairy, introduce an environmental label on foods, and create a behavior insight unit within the European Commission to inform policymaking. So now you have a broad overview of the different policies that I recommended. Now something that I want to go into is what is the impact of each policies that I estimated in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. So basically what you have here is just on the left of the different policies and the greenhouse gas reduction potential in two different metrics, one being what is the percent in terms of a percentage of all agricultural greenhouse gas, and then how much that is in terms of megatons of CO2 equivalent. And so basically what you see here is that those different policy options have impacts that are between 0.1, so this one has a quite small direct impact, to about like 13% of all agriculture greenhouse gas. So that's for the European Union as a whole. And something that I realized from my research is that, of course, all the work I did, it was with the European Commission. It's tailored a little bit to the European Union, but I think a lot of these policies and a lot of my recommendations in general can be adapted to pretty much all developed countries, developed economies. So now let's go a little bit deeper into each of these policies to really see what's behind. I will cover them. I won't go too much into the details of the assessment of each option, but that's something that I'm happy to cover later on in the discussion or in the Q&A. So if I'm starting with reducing subsidies, going to meat and dairy production. So in Europe, that would be within the Common Agricultural Policy. This is basically the biggest European funded program. So there's about, and within the cap, there is about 30 billion of European public subsidies that go to meat and dairy production or the feed crops that are used in meat and dairy. And so what I'm suggesting here are basically three key adjustments to the current way that the subsidies are allocated within the cap. The first one is to reduce by half basically the coupled payments that go to ruminant livestock production, dairy production, and the feed crops, and redirect this funding to towards protein crops. So for example, pulses, beans, and so on. And also have some of this funding allocated to support producers who are willing to transition. So from meat and dairy production to other types of activities. And here the greenhouse gas reduction potential that I computed, it's based on assuming so that half of the funding that goes currently to meat and dairy is redirected. And so in terms of the assessment of such a policy, so basically this is just to show you which type of assessment I made on each of the different policies. So I looked at operational feasibility, the cost for public finances, the impact on health, on food prices, on producers, and there's also a little bit more. You can find, there's a lot of information on that also on my full report, which I'm happy to share. In this presentation, I will focus on the key challenges of each options. And so basically, in the case of reducing subsidies, I mean, unsurprisingly, I think the biggest challenge will be the strong reaction from the meat and dairy producers, which are in Europe represented by quite powerful interest groups that are very, very active in lobbying at the European Commission level, basically. And they will strongly oppose this kind of measure. So now moving on to the second policy. So it's about introducing an emission trading scheme for agriculture. And so here really the idea is to implement a European market of agricultural greenhouse gas emission permits that would affect all agricultural production activities in a life cycle approach. So basically what this means is extending the system that we already have for the industry to agriculture. And that would cover not only meat and dairy production, but also basically all types of agricultural production. But of course, the biggest impact would be on the most greenhouse gas intensive foods, such as beef. And for the greenhouse gas reduction potential, the numbers I have here are based on an assessment that was already done by the European Joint Research Center. They did that in 2010. And actually the greenhouse gas reduction potential, this is something with this kind of system that you can choose. You can have specific targets, and here it was like 13% in the assessment that they made, but you could, of course, year after year, you could increase the target. And just like with the other emission trading scheme, you could put your target higher or lower depending on the goal that you're setting. And so here, the key challenge really would be the operationalization of an emission trading scheme, because there's just a very large number of farmers in the EU. And so especially it's always harder to put this kind of system into place when you don't have like big players, but when you have these scattered small scale farmers, they would probably be the ones who would be hit the most by the transaction cost and the administrative cost. And so that's why it would be challenging, basically. Now the third one, so it's about reducing consumer food waste through communication and education campaigns. And so here, so the idea is that it would make a lot of sense to tackle consumer food waste, because it's more than half, like it's 53% of the food waste that takes place at consumer level. And so to reduce it, successful campaigns should tackle 5 specific themes that are very practical, and these have shown basically in different studies to have the highest impact. And so those 5 themes, it's to help people purchase food based on planned meals, to reduce food waste from spoilage, prepare and serve appropriate amounts to reduce food waste from leftovers, store food appropriately, store and reuse leftovers, and redistribute and recycled food surplus. And a goal here of this type of policy could be a 20% reduction in consumer food waste over 5 years. The reason why I'm talking about this specific goal is that it's the same order of magnitude than what was achieved by the Love Food, Hate Waste campaign that was carried in the UK. So just to give you a little bit more background, because I think it's an interesting example of such a policy. So there they had this message of really giving practical advice and tools to reduce food waste. It was like meal planners, portion calculators, tips for storage of food, these kind of things. They used quite a lot of different media. They used like social media, radio alerts, local advertising. And they had also these, like, you can see a picture here of like these stands where they would show people how to cook with leftovers, for example. And they have a website with a lot of different tips to make the most of your food, for example, to read the date labels on food, those kind of things. And it's quite impressive because they managed to achieve a 21% reduction in food waste over 5 years. They did that in London. And so it's really an example of a successful campaign where they went very practically with just like tips and tricks and tools for people to reduce their food waste. And basically the key challenge of this kind of policy would probably be to gather the necessary funding for the campaign and to recruit the relevant behavioral science and communication experts to make sure that it's designed in a way that is as effective as possible. But to be honest, I think what is nice about like reducing food waste is that it's very uncontroversial, because everybody agrees that it's a good thing to do. And so that's why it's probably not the most challenging idea to get across. Now the fourth policy recommendation, it's about negotiating binding agreements with retailers to nudge towards less meat and dairy and reduce food waste. So here the idea is to focus on having an agreement between the retailers and the European Commission. And the reason for for this kind of policy is that basically at a retailer level, there's a lot that can be done to nudge consumers towards less meat, dairy, and reduce food waste. So on the part of the retailers, the requirements would be so there are 4 different ones. So to change the design and signaling of supermarkets to lower purchase of meat and dairy and redirect consumers towards fruit, vegetables, whole grain cereals, nuts, and so on. Also implement specific actions to reduce household level food waste. So one example that I've seen in the literature, for example, were some supermarkets who were doing promotions, and instead of saying, if you buy one, you get one free now, they would say, if you buy one, you get one free, but a week later. And this is just a small example of helping to not having just consumers like over purchasing things that they don't necessarily need, and not having like too much at the same time. So the third one would be reduce waste at retail level, so at the level of the retailer themselves, and report publicly on the amount of food they waste and the greenhouse gas linked to their sales. Because like this, the retailers would also have an incentive to reduce their own amount of food and the greenhouse gas linked to their sales, because they have to report it publicly, and this would be public information basically. And on the side of the EU, their side of the agreement, and so the way also to attract retailers into the agreement would be that they would have access to an innovation fund put forward by the EU. And the goal of that would be to share the cost of retailers when they test new interventions. So for example, when a retailer wants to try to redesign like the layout of a supermarket, that they can have EU funds to basically cover these costs and then have this knowledge shared with all the people from the agreement. And the EU would also have to, of course, monitor the compliance of the participants with the agreement and report its impact. And the EU would also then create a label that identifies the retailers who comply with the agreement. There would be also then a way to lure people in, to lure the retailers into getting into the agreement. It would be that you can be rewarded in a way with this label, for example, that you can say, and you can be among like the good guys who have, for example, like the sustainable supermarkets label or something like that. And here I cannot resist to show you a few examples of successful nudges that have been implemented in supermarkets or other retailers, because I think they're quite interesting. So one thing that has been already tested is basically redesigning supermarkets. And that can help then gear customers towards healthier and often also less greenhouse gas intensive foods. So this is, for example, an intervention that has been done in London. They have created a nudge store, and the store was designed by health specialists to gear customers towards fruits, vegetables, pulses, and so on. And so on the left, what you can see is a standard supermarket layout. Basically, all the unhealthy foods are in red here. So you can see, for example, here the snacks, chocolates, and so on, just near the cashier. And there is all these like cakes, crisps, snacks, and so on at the end of every aisle, which are places where that really get a lot of attention of people. And in the redesigned supermarket layout, you can see that when you enter, you directly have this huge aisle of fruit and vegetables. And then you can find fruit and vegetables again near the cashier at the end, instead of like the chocolate bars and that kind of things. And these are just some pictures of that supermarket. So you can see that they have these like nice signs showing here are the beans, pulses, and so on. And so that's definitely one way quite effective to nudge people towards eating like and purchasing healthier foods. But then there's also some other interventions a bit simpler and probably much less costly that have been shown to have quite a strong impact. For example, a nudge in a supermarket would be to adding separators to the shopping carts. And basically, so it's just like some line, or sometimes they put really like a physical separator and a small sign saying like, put the fruit and vegetables here in the front of the cart. And there's a few different studies that have been done basically replicating the same kind of experiments. And the results are quite impressive, that basically when there is this divider telling people, put your fruit and vegetables in the front, people tend to do it. And so for example, in this specific study that was done in Virginia and Toronto, the sales of fruit and vegetables increased by over 200% when using a divided cart. So this is just small things that have quite a big impact. And the last one I'll just show is it's another type of nudge that they did in the supermarket, where basically what they did here is they placed green arrows on the floor of the grocery store that led to the fruit and vegetable sections. And so they had green arrows with messages like follow green, arrow for health, or these kind of things, with little smileys and graphics of fruit and vegetables. And actually they just noticed that people tended to just follow the arrows on the floor, and the proportion of produce spending also increased significantly. And what is quite interesting is that they really looked also at the fact that the total food spending per customer did not increase. So people really replaced other types of food that they usually buy with fruit and vegetables, which is quite striking. So that's it for the nudges. And basically, probably the biggest challenge here is basically getting retailers buy-in into the agreement. So there has been agreements in a little bit similar, especially in the field of like reducing food waste, that have been done in the past. For example, in the UK or in Norway, they have like successful examples of these agreements between like the government of the country and the retailers. But still, it's always a little bit challenging to get retailers buy-in. So now moving on to the regulatory barriers for alternatives to meat and dairy to reach the market. They're basically speaking with people who are in close contact with food entrepreneurs. There's really two key areas where there are some barriers that if they were removed, could help accelerate the expansion of alternatives to meat and dairy in the EU. And basically those two policies would be, well, first of all, being able for these innovative foods to continue to use the words burger or sausage on the packaging of their products. So this is basically this concern that I've heard actually from, for example, the executive chair of Beyond Meat. It comes from the fact that in the EU, it has already been voted that so plant-based milks like soy milk or almond milk, they cannot use the word milk on their packaging. So they have to, the almond milk would be called like almond beverage or something like that. And that's basically comes from the fact that the dairy interest groups were very strong and put a lot of pressure on the EU to make such a ruling. And so a lot of producers of alternative meat and dairy are afraid that the same will happen to for the words like burger or sausage. And then the second one is basically just to obtain a clear description of the approval process for meat alternatives to be sold in the EU, because currently it's actually very hard for food entrepreneurs to navigate the whole process and to have their foods approved for sale in the EU market. And so in terms of really the main challenge for this type of policy is really to resist the demands of the meat interest groups that are asking for the regulation of the words like burger and sausage. And it's often with, I mean, basically the reason that would be put forward is like that it's confusing for customers or things like that. But really there's a need to assess whether these are valid claims or not, basically. Now we're going to educating kids on the health and environmental impact of meat and dairy. So basically here, it's quite a specific program that is currently running in the EU. So they have these school fruit, vegetables, and milk schemes that is so financed by the EU, where basically they distribute fruit, vegetables, milk, also like yogurts, those kind of things to school children across Europe. It's quite a massive program actually, and it's also the goal that they then do like sessions where they inform kids about nutrition and these kind of things. And basically what I'm suggesting here is to make two key changes to this program. So first of all, it would be to also educate the kids about the environmental impacts of meat and dairy and not only talk about the nutrition aspects. And also to replace like half of the cow milk by plant-based milks. And so for example, the impact in terms of greenhouse gas reduction potential of 0.1% of all agricultural greenhouse gas, it would be just by replacing half of the cow's milk by plant-based milk. And here, the main challenge of this specific policy, it's really to, I guess, to overcome the resistance to plant-based milks that is created both by the fact that there is different nutritional value compared to cow's milk, but also just created by the dairy interest groups in the EU, basically. Now moving on to the labeling. So here the idea would be to introduce an environmental label on food, both in retail and food services. So it would be the goal to have that both for like the packaging of food, but also on the menus in a restaurant, for example. And the idea here would really be to provide easy to understand information, a little bit similar to what is already in place with the energy labels. So these labels, they were really created by like the European Commission, and you have them on all electrical appliances. So for example, this is one of a washing machine. So we already have such kind of labels for electric appliances. And in terms of food, we have, it's not mandatory yet. They are discussing whether to make it mandatory in the EU, but there is already these Nutri scores where you can see on the packaging of a lot of foods a rating from A to E, basically saying whether the food is healthy or not. So the idea would be to have something similar, but showing on foods their environmental impact. Because there's basically still a lot of people who really don't think at all about the environment when they buy certain types of foods, and they really just have, it's just not at all on top of people's minds. So the idea here would really be to bring this information to the people. And there's a few specific characteristics that should be in place to make the information really easy to understand. And those specific characteristics are basically inspired by things that have been shown to be working for calorie labels. So there's a lot of this evidence there that I think can also be used and be applicable for environmental labels. And so these labels should be both used in retail, so on food packaging, and also in food services, so in the restaurant. They should include an evaluative aspect, so a color code or smileys, for example, because it has been shown to influence people much more than just a measure. And that's I found quite an interesting one. So basically, labels have shown to be more effective if they are placed on the left side for countries where people read from left to right, and on the right side when it's the other way around. So in the EU, most of the languages, you read them from left to right. And actually, when you see the label with the calories, for example, but also with then the environmental footprint, if you see it before, it has more impact on your behavior than if you see it afterwards. Because basically, when you've already made your mind that you want the cheeseburger, I think you will take the cheeseburger, even though you can see that the environmental impact is really bad. So having the label first. And so in Israel, for example, if it's in Hebrew, since you read it from right to left, it would be the other way around. And then in terms of like the main challenges of such a measure, it's really the biggest challenge is probably to reach an agreement on what is the life cycle assessment, or what are the specific metrics that you would use for such a label? Because you could think of having a label that describes like the greenhouse gas emissions for this type of food, but you could also look at water usage, you could use at eutrophication, you could use at, I mean, quite a lot of different things. So that's probably the biggest challenge, is to reach an agreement on which specific metric to use, and also then have a way to measure it. And then, so the last one of the policies that I wanted to speak about, it's so to create a behavior insight unit within the European Commission to inform policymaking. And here it's quite a lot inspired on what has been done in the UK, where they had this behavioral insight team, used to be part of the UK government. So the idea really is to have a cross-sectional behavior insight unit that would start with a team of 7 people, with policy specialists, academics from behavioral science, social psychology, neuroscience, and anthropology. And the goal really would be to bridge the gap between the science, everything we know about behavior science, and policymaking. And so this team would work really like across the European Commission. And here, really the key challenge is really to create this new team and to attract the specific profiles that would be most interesting to have. So with this, I've basically gone through like the specific policy recommendations that I made. I just want to, before we move on to the Q&A, I just want to show you a little bit like the latest news from the farm to fork strategy, because so basically, just to give you an idea, I did my research, I finished it at the end of March, and I shared then my report, and I spoke to basically all the people from the European Commission that I had been in contact with so that they would get the results. And then on May 20th, so just a little bit over a month ago, the European Commission released a communication with the first, basically the biggest points that will be in the farm to fork strategy. So it's not yet very specific in terms of policies. There's some, but like the main ideas are there. And so just to show you, so this is basically just a screenshot of this communication. And so what I thought was the most interesting, I'm obviously biased, but so I thought it was interesting that they had a whole chapter on promoting sustainable food consumption and facilitating the shift to healthy sustainable diets, and also a whole chapter on reducing food loss and food waste. And so to give you, I selected some extracts that I thought were the most interesting. So for example, on environmental labeling, so they have included that in their latest version. So basically what they say here, let me okay, that's okay. So basically in terms of environmental labeling, so they want to have a label that covers the nutritional, climate, environmental, and social aspects of food products. So that's quite exciting. In terms of educating kids and the EU school scheme, so they said that they would review the school scheme. This one was more of a surprise because there wasn't so much talk about it before. And they want to enhance its contribution to sustainable food consumption, in particular, talk about nutrition, sustainable food production, and reducing food waste with the kids. So I think this is quite cool. In terms of reducing food waste, they don't talk so much about specific policies, but they do say that they want to halve per capita food waste at the retail and consumer levels by 2030, that they want to set a baseline and propose legally binding targets to reduce food waste across the EU. And the only like specific policy that they mention is they talk about like the dates marking, like the use by and best before dates, because there's basically a lot of research showing that people don't understand those dates very well. And so it leads to food waste. And so they want to revise the European rules to take into account the the latest research. And finally, they also do talk about making low greenhouse gas foods, so like fruit and vegetables. They talk about making it cheaper. And here, so they talk about basically adjusting VAT rates to allow member states to make more targeted use of these rates. So for example, to support organic fruits and vegetables. And they also talk about adapting European tax systems so that the price of different foods will reflect their real costs. So this was just released a little bit over a month ago. And it's quite exciting for me to see, because I think there's interesting things in there. I wish there were even more, but it's already, I think they're heading slowly in the right direction. And it's, basically it's something that if you're interested in kind of things, it's quite easy to follow it. If you just type like Farm to Fork European Commission, you will directly see all the full communication and all the news about this new strategy. And they are really like currently, the people I interacted with from the European Commission, they are currently working on choosing the specific policies and the specific funding and so on that will go to the strategy. So this is quite exciting. And so that's it. I think I've covered most of what I wanted to say. So I'm gonna leave my email address here so that just in case you want me to send you like the full report, or if you are interested in following up after this presentation, really don't hesitate to contact me. And I think, yeah, we can move on to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Carole, for a very, very interesting lecture. I really enjoyed it. I also enjoyed reading your thesis and kind of seeing all the process that you've gone along with coming up with this food policy. I don't want to take too much of the time, and I would like to have for other people to ask questions, but I want to start off by asking two questions of my own, and then letting other people start, and maybe also bring this into the context of Israel, where our organization is trying to initiate a process of doing food policy, looking at food policy on a national level. My first question is actually about why did you choose meat in particular, and why did you focus on demand side policies? And you mentioned this very briefly at the beginning, but the reason I ask is because the context of Israel, this is where I would start. I would start with those same kind of direction. Although food policy is very comprehensive and includes so many disciplines and so many directions, you have to start off from somewhere. So the reason I would start off would be just because Israel is one of the highest per capita consumers of meat. And so obviously making a change in that direct, large win-win. And the second reason is that Israel has a very, which is very different from Europe, is that almost all of the feed that goes into producing animal in Israel comes from outside the country. And so that is not in any way calculated in any of the environmental metrics done. So agriculture here in Israel is estimated by the Ministry of Agriculture to be somewhere around 3% of greenhouse gas emissions, for example. But some estimates put the entire food consumption at somewhere around 25% when you encompass the burdens coming outside the country. And so focusing on demand side policies would probably be the most important way to move forward to actually look at an overall reduction in environment and health. So with that very kind of quick introduction, what is your, I mean, why did you focus on these directions?
Yeah, no, and this is super relevant. And actually the situation is not entirely different in the EU. So what you mentioned, so for example, the fact that there is a very high consumption of meat, that's definitely the case in the EU. There's large differences between countries, but overall it's very high, and it's much higher than the health recommendations of the WHO or basically any metric that you can take. And the fact that a lot of feed comes from outside, it's maybe a little bit, I mean, some of the feed is produced in the EU, but also a lot of it comes from outside. We're still importing soy from Brazil, for example, that comes pretty much directly from deforested land. So they are starting to look at this, but actually it's also a question that they have internally, from the conversation I've had, they are starting to basically, the way that we measure greenhouse gas emissions right now, it's really where is it emitted, and it only depends on that. Like if it's emitted in the EU, it's going to be EU greenhouse gases. But they are really thinking a lot about the fact that we should not only take those into account, but also the emissions linked to the production of the feed that come from elsewhere, and also the emissions linked to what we import in general. So that's really a discussion that they have right now. So it's actually for the same reasons that you mentioned that I chose to focus on meat and dairy. It's really because they are just responsible for the majority of the greenhouse gases linked to agriculture. And agriculture is still quite significant. And also what attracted me there is honestly that it's much more neglected. Basically in the EU, they focus a lot on looking how you can optimize the production, which feed you can give to the cows so that they emit less methane, for example, these kind of things. Those things are researched like very, very heavily. And there is much, much less work that has already been done on the consumption side and how to influence the consumption. So this is also why I thought it's simply, I can make more of a contribution, and it's maybe a little bit more helpful to focus on a topic that is neglected, basically. And so, yeah, I guess that's the main reason.
Okay, that's really interesting. My second question, and then I'll pass it on to others, is more about the process that you've gone through with coming up with these recommendations. So as an organization, we're also thinking about starting this whole process, which is, starting off with so many disciplines and so many stakeholders, and so you want to understanding how you dealt with that, and how you've taken all the various stakeholders and put that all together in a way that you could eventually, and the recommendations that you came up at the end. Could you tell us a little bit about the process? You did mention about it, but some of the lessons that you could share with us, for us to start this path of going down the road of food policy in Israel.
Yeah, no, definitely. It is quite a challenging topic, I find, because it's really at the intersection of health, the environment, and basically overall like economics and policymaking and these kind of things. So it's not so easy always to know where to start and with which like stakeholders to involve. So here, basically what I did mostly is to try to focus on the main people who were working on this from agriculture, health, and really like the climate aspects of it. So I identified those specific people. Those are the people that I worked with the most. But to be clear, not everyone is as interested in this. I mean, for example, the people from the Directorate General on Climate Action, they are very much interested in the greenhouse gas aspect of it. And they are in favor of these kind of things in general. I mean, they're not like, I mean, they're already in favor of that. Whereas the people from the agriculture world in general, it's already a little bit more tricky because there is much more this, I mean, they're in much closer contact, I guess, with all the interest groups of like the producers, the dairy, the meat producers, and so on. And so for them, it's much less what is not about, like, they really are much more into like optimizing the production as much as they can, and like aligning, for example, the public subsidies to the adoption of like green practices or that kind of things. But there, I mean, the idea of really trying to influence consumption choices, they are much less familiar or comfortable with these kind of things. But I think it's really important to involve them still, because even though you need to warm them up to the idea little by little. And actually, I even met with some interest groups, like meat interest groups so they're not linked to the European Commission, but those are basically the people who go and speak with the people from the Commission. And I think it's just really important to understand where they come from and what they have in mind. And basically what the conclusion personally with talking with these meat interest groups was really that they tend to point at how it's hard to measure, and we are not sure, and there is uncertainty around like how much greenhouse gas comes from each animal, and we're not going to we should not tell people what to eat. I mean, it will be really those kind of arguments. And I think it's just important to understand that and to meet them as well, because they will then influence the people who make the policies. So like this, you have, I think it's interesting to know which kind of arguments that they use, so that you can know how you can respond to that.
You also did you also meet with officials in ministries and NGOs to discuss some of your ideas?
Yeah, so I discussed with, for example, people from Greenpeace, Europe, and also from like Pro-Veg, so an organization that is like promoting like vegetables and pulses and so on. And I think they all had really very interesting comments to bring. And like Greenpeace, I mean, they've looked at this for so long that it's really helpful to just gather the knowledge and have the report. And they also have contacts with public officials, so they also do like a interest group kind of work. So it was really interesting to gather them as well in the conversation. And I think basically one big takeaway that I had from all of that, so apart from the fact that it's important to take into account, like, and to go to people from different sectors, so health, environment, and so on, it's also to, when we are at the point where we need to decide which policies to implement, to really look at both all the impacts, so the impact on the environment, the impact in terms of greenhouse gas in particular, and also the impacts on health. Because often these are really well aligned anyway, because if you just eat more fruit and vegetables, it's going to be less greenhouse gas and it's going to be healthier. I mean, they are really well aligned. And so I think it's interesting for a policymaker to see that they can hit different targets with the same policy, basically. And also that you will then have arguments that will appeal to both the people working on health and also to the people working on the environment. I think that was helpful.
Okay, that's really helpful and very interesting. To other people here who want to ask you or anyone else here, I've seen some questions on the chat, but if anyone else, before I go through that, or anyone, I see that there's some people who ask multiple questions, maybe they want to just come out and ask those directly. So please, if anyone wants to talk or ask, go ahead. Okay, so I could start by actually reading some of the questions here. You can go ahead and look at them as well. There's, let me see. Okay, first one goes, how does composting play into food waste reduction? When people buy more food, do they actually consume it, or is it wasted? So this is the first question. I see there's more. Okay, I'll go back afterwards, but there's one before that, but if you could address that first.
Sure. So no, that's a very interesting question, because definitely, so composting, I think it's very important in general, and it can definitely help reduce food waste. So from what I've seen, I think it's a really interesting question. Like, when people buy more food, do they actually consume it, or is it wasted? So I haven't seen this. I think where more research is needed, because for the research that I've seen, they don't go all the way to see whether people actually consume them or not. So they only measure how much people buy, but they didn't follow the customers all the way home to see whether it was actually consumed or not. And I think it's a totally fair question. And to be honest, I don't know if that has been already measured in specific studies. So that's definitely a field where it would be interesting to have more insights. And if anyone here has an answer to this question, I'm also interested to hear it. So if anyone knows, please.
I do, actually. In the United States, at least, generally speaking, perishable foods are going to be discarded less. So meat, dairy, fruits, and vegetables. So this policy could potentially be net good when compared to people purchasing extra meat and dairy products and shifting those to extra fruit and veg. You know, they'll be kind of waste neutral, but health and environment positive. But if the issue is that they're buying fewer potato chips and more fruits, then you could end up seeing even more food waste, because people generally throw out processed shelf-stable foods a lot less than they do those fresh things that can rot in their fridge.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that about composting. So composting does not reduce food waste. Composting is a way to reduce the environmental burdens of food waste. It doesn't, okay, it's just the outcome. So another question that goes about food waste. That's your question, Matthew. How does the food waste amounts and your policy suggestions accommodate different contexts? Individual household, restaurants, and institutions produce different types of food and have different forms of food waste. If you want to add more to what you said, I think some of your different policies address various different food waste, but you could answer that directly if you want.
Yeah, no, so that's a really good question. So in what I researched, so basically you can find data on like the breakdown of how much food waste is done at each level of the value chain. So how much is wasted at the consumer level, how much is wasted at the retailer level, and so on. And basically I focused mainly on the consumer level, and that's what I addressed with one of my policies about like the education campaigns, because it's the biggest source of waste. But definitely there's also things that can be done in other types of contexts. And I just know that, for example, at a retail level, there is only like 5% of the food waste that is generated at that stage. So that's a bit less, but there is indeed a significant waste more at like the food services level. So like restaurant, canteens, and so on. And they're basically, I haven't found like a lot of examples of very like general policies that have been implemented at like a country level or things like that. But basically I found there are some agreements, for example, in Norway about reducing food waste, where there are some, I think also like restaurants, chains, all that kind of things that are into the agreement, where they commit to like a certain amount of, a certain percentage of reduction of food waste to be achieved in a certain time, that kind of things. So there are some agreements in that field, but it is true that I've seen much less about restaurant than I've seen. And also in some countries, I think it was in France, for example, recently, but that's more for the retail. Basically, they banned the fact that it's not authorized anymore for retailers to just throw away food that is too close to the expiration date, so now they have to donate it to like charities or food rescue organizations. I believe that in Australia, they had a quite extensive and interesting plan to reduce their food waste at all different kinds of levels. And one of the big pillars of that was for food chains and restaurants and so on to partner with food rescue organizations, basically. That was like a big component of it.
Okay, another question here. Does the health impact of each strategy been studied? And maybe you could actually explain a little bit about your cost assessment of each one of those strategies. Say a few words about that as well.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of the health impact, what I've looked at the most in my assessments were basically, what I use is, so there's already quite a lot of research that shows that when you reduce, so starting from a classic Western diet, like the ones that we have in Europe or in the US or in a lot of developed countries, starting from that, if you reduce the amount of serving that you eat of meat, especially processed meat, red meat, and also to some extent, but less clear, dairy, basically reducing that reduces your risk of a bunch of different diseases like coronary, like heart diseases, diabetes, those kind of things. And so using that research that is already available, what I did is sometimes I just looked at what would be the effect on the consumption of meat, like red and processed meat in particular, because those are the ones that have the strongest negative health effects. And then I look at, okay, so if I see a reduction in volume or in consumption of meat of a certain percentage, this is what I report in my assessments. And then you can translate that in like a decreased risk of these particular diseases. But I didn't go much further into like quantifying exactly, for example, how many like lives saved, all these kind of things. It's more when some of my policies do have an impact on reducing meat, especially meat consumption. There I mentioned that there is then a positive effect on reducing disease risk, basically. But I didn't go much further. And then in terms of, for the overall cost of the different policies, it depends a little bit on each policy, like which method I use to compute or to get an estimate of this cost. But mostly it's looking at programs that have been done elsewhere and then doing an inference on how much will it cost to do that for the entire EU, for example. So for example, with the education campaign, I used the cost per household that was borne by the Love Food Hate Waste campaign that was carried in the UK. And I basically just multiply this by the number of households that are in the EU and the duration of the campaign to evaluate the cost of how much that would be for the EU. For some of other policies, the computation of the cost, I rely on assessments that have been done either by the European Research Center when they have done some, or by other institutions that have already looked at this in particular. And that you can find in my full report. I have for each policy like a description of how I computed the cost, how I computed the greenhouse gas reduction potential, and so on.
Okay. Okay. Rachel's question, would environmental label be introduced along with a consumer education campaign or in a vacuum?
That's a very interesting question, actually. I think that's a very good point. Probably it should be, it should definitely be with the consumer education campaign. I did not look too much into that, but I mean, now that I see this, I'm like, okay, this seems so evident that it should be, because basically what I've seen is there's been some research that they've done in multiple countries, like some European countries, also the US, basically asking people how much they know about the environmental impact of foods, and it's just really, really very low. And so if people just start seeing like like an environmental label just like that, and they have never thought of this before, they will definitely have no way, I think, to comprehend it. But what could be done is, so a little bit similar to the Nutri scores that they have for like the health score of different products. What they did, I mean, at least in Belgium, because I've seen these ads and so I know, but I think they did that in multiple European countries, is that they have these ads on TV saying like, oh, there's now like the Nutri scores, it goes from A to E, and it says whether the foods are, it's based on this and this metric. And so they explain a little bit so there's really ads like running that basically describe how the metric works and what it means. And I think definitely it makes total sense that they should do the same kind of campaign for the environmental labeling so that people can really interpret them the right way. That's a really good point.
Okay, so moving another question from Amos, would the labeling consider the environmental impacts of plant-based food as well, such as palm oil?
Yeah, I think that would have to be the case. So just like the other types of labels, it should be done on all kinds of foods, and quite naturally, I mean, quite logically, the foods like, so meat and dairy will appear more badly on this score than like the vegetables and so on, because they really don't have like a very strong environmental impact. But I think definitely this label should be for all types of foods, not just the meat and dairy, because like this, it allows really a comparison. People can really see, oh, I see this same label on, it's just like the Nutri scores. They also have the Nutri scores on like fruits and vegetables and these kind of things that are not complex products. But what is interesting is that people can now see, oh, on this bag of like spinach, I see an A, and on my on these biscuits that I bought, or this, you know, oil or whatever, I see a worse score. So it's I think the comparison that makes the label really useful and telling for people.
Yeah, I agree. So I see there's no more questions, and if there are any last one who wants to write or raise his or her hand for a last question before we end. So again, in the meantime, I'll thank you again, Carole, for taking the time and sharing your insights and work with us. Thank you so much. We look forward to reaching out to you and connecting about our process here in Israel and getting your thoughts about what we're doing here. I'll definitely keep in touch with you. And if anyone else wants to get in touch with Carole, she left her email contacts, and I know she'll be very happy to share her work and get your feedback as well. So with this, I will end. Thank you again, everyone, for attending this meeting and learning about food policy. And until our next time here, probably in a month or so, looking forward to seeing all of you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I would like to add just that the talk will be available on the IFSN website. I've been asked, so it will be on the website, on the YouTube channel. And so the one who can join today, you'll be able to see. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.